Welcome to Wyoming Catholic College's distance learning series on classic literature and the virtue of hope. My name is Dr. Glenn Arbery, and I'll be presenting the first three lectures of the course on Homer, Virgil, and Dante. Dr. John Free will follow with lectures on Shakespeare's late romances, the English novel, and the poetry of T.S. Eliot. The primary purpose of the course is to explore what great literature has to teach us about the virtue of hope. Dr. Free and I will be talking about a number of classic texts and will be pulling certain themes from them. But let me say at the outset that what we hope is that we will send you back to the works themselves. Listening to these lectures is no substitute for reading the Iliad or the Divine Comedy or the Tempest. Flannery O'Connor, as usual, puts it wonderfully. People have a habit of saying, "What is the theme of your story?" And they expect you to give them a statement. The theme of my story is the economic pressure of the machine on the middle class, or some such absurdity. And when they've got a statement like that, they go off happy and feel it is no longer necessary to read the story. Some people have the notion that you read the story and then climb out of it into the meaning. But for the fiction writer himself, the whole story is the meaning because it is an experience, not an abstraction. O'Connor is talking about her own short stories, but she speaks for any true work of literature. You cannot begin to say that you know what these works are about until you have undergone the honest labor of imagination that they require. In his book, The Gift, Lewis Hyde writes of the labor of gratitude that the highest gifts require of us. A gift that has the power to change us awakens a part of the soul, but we cannot receive the gift until we meet it as an equal. We therefore submit ourselves to the labor of becoming like the gift. What Dr. Free and I are doing in this short course is predicated on the labor of gratitude that great literature asks of us. Imagine the lifelong labors of art, the great resources of observation and study that went into the composition of these works, line by line, page by page. Imagine the reverent effort of preserving them, generation after generation, so that they are available to us. Imagine what it takes to translate Homer or Virgil or Dante, line by line, in the attempt to find English equivalents for the original Greek or Latin or Italian. The labor of gratitude means not skimming the work for a few well-worn ideas or some handy theme, as O'Connor puts it, as though great works of literature were just a way to package concepts. These works must be experienced. They bear great fruit, but only when readers give their imaginations over to them and live them, as it were, and in doing so enact within themselves the reach and power of epic hope. Why concentrate on hope, and why use literature to do it? One way to understand why we're concentrating on hope is simply to look around at the state of the culture and the situation of the modern world. On the one hand, radical secular egalitarianism continues to erode institutions and moral standards that appeared impregnable in my grandmother's generation. When I think what it would be like to explain certain contemporary realities to my grandmother, a redoubtable lady who died in 1989 at the age of 102, I wouldn't know where to begin. On the other hand, a new and radically intolerant religious extremism, ironically fueled by the secular egalitarianism that both condemns it and fears it, has made Christian martyrdom a contemporary reality on a scale that rivals or exceeds the days of the early church. Paradoxically, though, to be reminded of the state of the world at large might actually help focus our attention. It might stir up our spiritedness, prompt us to reject the dubious posture of victimhood, and rouse our hope in God. In a way, the real temptation to hopelessness is simpler and closer to home, the fact of death itself. In Aeschylus' play Prometheus Bound, one of the major gifts that Prometheus gives to men is blind hope, which takes away the expectancy of death. In other words, if we cannot forget that we will inevitably die, We will regard everything we do as futile and not even attempt it. As Christians, of course, we know that Christ has conquered death, so that our hope is not blind. But the modern secular world has lost sight of this genuine hope and emphasized the distraction of activity instead. Joseph Pieper pointed out the problem with urgency in his book shortly after World War II, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. He underscored the argument again, even more urgently, in his book On Hope, a generation later, when he wrote that slothful sadness is one of the determining characteristics of the hidden profile of our age, of an age that has proclaimed the standard of the world of total work. Acedia, often misleadingly translated as sloth, is the signature of every age that seeks, in its despair, to shake off the obligations of that nobility of being that is conferred by Christianity, and so in its despair to deny its true self. To be guilty of acedia, as we shall see in later lectures, ultimately has to do with the theological virtue of hope, not with hope simply. Pieper argues that hope combines magnanimity, greatness of soul, with humility. Magnanimity, he writes, a much forgotten virtue, is the aspiration of the Spirit to great things, while humility, rightly understood, is not an external attitude, but man's recognition and acceptance of the reality of his nature. As the anonymous medieval author of The Cloud of Unknowing puts it, a man is humble when he stands in the truth with a knowledge and appreciation for himself as he really is. Even on the natural level, it does not mean small-souled self-deprecation, but a kind of clear-eyed realism about oneself. Magnanimity directs hope to its true possibilities, and humility reveals the limitations of these possibilities and preserves them from sham realization, says Pieper. Back in the 1980s, Alan Bloom described many of the students he encountered as souls without longing. In other words, lacking in magnanimity, passive, disconsolate, indifferent. Many students arrive in college with virtually no background in the classical and biblical tradition that might stir their sense of nobility. And many colleges offer them little or no access to the great tradition. The education they get, one assumes, will give them hope in the economic sense. They will be able to adapt to circumstances, make money, and settle into commodious living, as Thomas Hobbes describes it. Their parents and many of their professors will be satisfied if they come out of college with marketable skills. But the absence of a compelling experience of greatness in the classics makes students ripe for a lifetime of acedia. In my lecture on Dante's Purgatorio, I'll have more to say about acedia. But here we need to distinguish between natural hope and the virtue of hope. Of natural hope, Pieper says that, like love, it is one of the very simple, primordial dispositions of the living person. Thomas Aquinas defines hope as an irascible passion, as opposed to a concupiscible passion. In other words, it comes from the spirited part of the soul that we feel in our chest as anger and courage, the part that the ancient Greeks call thumos, and that we sometimes call heart. In his article on hope as an irascible passion, Thomas writes that in the object of hope, we may note 4 conditions. First, that it is something good. Since properly speaking, hope regards only the good. In this respect, hope differs from fear, which regards evil. Secondly, that it is future, for hope does not regard that which is present and already possessed. In this respect, hope differs from joy, which regards a present good. Thirdly, that it must be something arduous and difficult to obtain, for we do not speak of anyone hoping for trifles, which are in one's power to have at any time. In this respect, hope differs from desire or cupidity, which regards the future good absolutely. Wherefore, it belongs to the concupiscible, while hope belongs to the irascible faculty. We're still with St. Thomas. Fourthly, that this difficult thing is something possible to obtain, for one does not hope for that which one cannot get at all. And in this respect, hope differs from despair. On this last point, Thomas means that only something difficult but ultimately within reach can be the object of hope. But natural hope can be deluded. In writing about the war between Athens and Sparta, Thucydides gives many examples of delusion, and he even comments at one point that it is a habit of mankind to entrust to careless hope what they long for, and to use sovereign reason to thrust aside what they do not desire. Hope as a virtue, on the other hand, is a different matter. Pieper writes that hope is either a theological virtue or not a virtue at all. It becomes a virtue by becoming a theological virtue. In other words, when its end is God Himself. But perhaps there's something between natural hope and Christian theological hope. I wouldn't dare argue with Joseph Pieper, whom I revere, but in my first two lectures, I'll be concentrating on a special case of hope characteristic of epic heroes that's close to theological hope. In the quite distinct world of epic, writes Louise Cowan, the gods descend to cooperate directly with the mortal protagonist and the poet in fashioning an order in which myth can be reinterpreted to redeem history. I'd like to call the result of this cooperation epic hope, the capacity to look magnanimously to an end, a telos, in such a way that humility guides one's actions in the present, however distant those actions may seem from the end to be attained. This hope involves divine prompting, even a divine mandate. For the ancient Greeks and Romans, this kind of hope is rare because the heroes who have it already possess a unique greatness of soul that seems to merit divine attention. Achilles and Odysseus have this kind of hope, as do Aeneas and Dante, although we see the theological virtue of hope in Dante as the transformation of epic hope. In the epics, the heroes are not optimistic, which is more a disposition to think positively, like the little engine that could. They're not simply wishing for success, as when we say, I hope everything turns out well. They don't even necessarily have the good feelings associated with fair winds and a new dawn and open horizons. In fact, those feelings might mislead them. The most important manifestations of epic hope, in fact, are tinged with melancholy and certainly accompanied by sacrifice. And here we come to the intrinsic relation between classical epics and hope, or better, the kind of hope that they enact in us when we read them well. Epics embody hope in the greatness of what they are as poems, as realizations of noble aspiration. Homer's two epics narrate two large actions that involve epic hope in different ways. I'll just be touching on the Iliad, and then I'll turn to concentrate on the Odyssey, since the hope its action embodies is closer to theological hope. The Iliad centers on the menace or supernatural wrath of the Greek hero Achilles, the greatest warrior in a time when war is a constant and the virtues of the warrior are most esteemed. He's a figure of supreme thumos and wrath, and he knows his own importance. He's forthright in speech, and he refuses to dissemble. As he tells Odysseus at one crucial juncture, as I hate the doorways of death, I detest that man who hides one thing in the depths of his heart and speaks forth another. Everyone else in the poem who is praised for looks, speed, power, and ferocity in battle always, without fail, takes second place to Achilles. but there is considerable honor simply in being the next best, as Ajax is. Achilles has a moral steepness about him, a lonely sublimity of superiority that makes him intimidating and all but inaccessible to those around him. The action of the poem centers on his wrath at being dishonored. The Odyssey, on the other hand, centers on the long-delayed homecoming of Odysseus, known before all men, as he tells the Phaeacians, with the study of crafty designs. Zeus himself says that Odysseus is beyond all other men in mind. If Achilles is the great, shining, forthright warrior, Odysseus is the master of artful disguises, the accomplished storyteller, not to say liar, who does what he must do to end his long wandering and resume his rightful place in his own household with his own wife and son. It's important to see that Achilles is not simply an egotist. He has a realistic understanding of who he is and why the army needs to acknowledge him, as the whole of the poem makes clear. And before he is dishonored, his actions clearly aim at the good of all. At the beginning of the action, he intervenes when the Achaean commander Agamemnon refuses to give back a captive girl to her father, who has come to ransom her. The girl's father is a priest of Apollo, which Agamemnon should have noticed, and by insulting the priest, Agamemnon also insults the god, who sends down a plague that rages through the Achaean army for 9 days. Achilles calls an assembly and allows the prophet Calchas actually asks for his protection, to reveal that their suffering is the fault of the overbearing Agamemnon. As a result, Agamemnon has to give the girl back to her father, but in his rage, he takes away Achilles' girl, Briseis, who was awarded to him as his prize. Outraged in turn by the insult and the failure of the other Achaeans to stand up for him, Achilles withdraws from the fighting and calls upon his divine mother Thetis to go to Zeus and ask for the restoration of his honor. But the problem is not simply the insult perpetrated by Agamemnon. As the poem develops, it becomes clear that the real insult is mortality itself. In asking his mother to go to Zeus, Achilles says, "Since, my mother, you bore me to be a man with a short life, therefore Zeus of the loud thunder on Olympus should grant me honor at least. He wants the Achaeans to lose at the hands of Hector and the Trojans until they understand how necessary Achilles is, how much more important he is than the rest of the army combined." Zeus nods his head to this request, and the rest of the poem is the enactment of this divine promise. Stripped of all the outward signs of honor, godlike Achilles, who would have been the greatest of the gods, the myths tell us, if his mother had married Zeus or Poseidon, hopes for redemption. But even when the Achaeans do in fact lose and send an embassy to plead with him to return, he refuses, both because he sees that Zeus is granting him honor and because the real issue is death itself. As he says to Odysseus after hearing of the immense gifts Agamemnon will give him if he returns, fate is the same for the man who holds back, the same if he fights hard. We are all held in a single honor, the brave with the weaklings. A man dies still if he has done nothing, as one who has done much. In other words, death cancels out all accomplishment. The only true honor would be immortality. Achilles' hope for honor sufficient to his stature as the greatest of the Achaeans is in a way not the point. With the help of Zeus, he achieves this honor. Indeed, he achieves something surpassing all ordinary honor, the kleos aphthiton, or immortal glory in song that is the Iliad itself. But Achilles' hope turns out to be tragic, because in requesting his honor and watching the gratifying defeat of the Achaeans through most of the poem, he discovers that he has inadvertently condemned to death his closest friend, Patroclus, and set in motion the events that will lead to his own demise shortly after he kills Hector in retribution. Both Patroclus and Hector are doubles or alternative versions of Achilles. Patroclus as his friend who wears Achilles' armor into battle as his substitute, trying to trick the Trojans into thinking that Achilles himself has returned, and incidentally spare the life of Achilles. But Hector kills Patroclus, takes the armor, and wears it himself in attacking the Achaeans. Always eclipsed by Achilles in the past, he hopes that he can drive the Achaeans back to the beach, burn their ships, and then destroy them all. He very nearly succeeds. But his hope, too, turns out to be delusional because his great deeds spur Achilles to return and put him in his place. In order to avenge Patroclus, Achilles has to kill Hector, and his own death is decreed soon after Hector's, as his mother reminds him when she hears what he is resolved to do. "I must die soon then," he responds. What Achilles truly desires is immortality, the status of a god. But the only immortality he can actually have is the perpetuation of his story at the cost of his suffering and death. Because he approximates a god who suffers and dies, he has an ontological pathos that the French thinker Pierre Manant understands next to the Gospels. He comments that unlike the death of the 70-year-old Socrates in the Phaedo, the Gospels, like the Iliad, culminate in the death of a young man. Jesus is both Patroclus and Hector. More precisely, in the Christian representation, Jesus is for each person what Hector and Patroclus are for Achilles. The enemy he is pierced with blows, and the friend, the brother, who was pierced with blows for him. This is where Manant says, I would see the paradoxical proximity between Homer and the Gospels. But the parallels between the Gospels and Homer are perhaps even more evident, though not in this tragic way, in the Odyssey. Two great actions characterized by hope are set in motion by the goddess Athena in the first book of the poem. Odysseus' son Telemachus finds himself mired in a prolonged adolescence because of the 20-year absence of his father. His father might be dead, as Telemachus often imagines, but Odysseus might also still be alive, a possibility that his mother Penelope keeps open, delaying a decision to remarry, even as her 108 suitors outrageously feast daily upon the substance of Odysseus' estate. The first action instigated by Athena, then, is to rouse Telemachus' nobility by sending him on a mission to find out what he can about his father by traveling to see two of Odysseus' friends from the Trojan War, Nestor and Menelaus. Appearing to the young man in disguise as an older friend of Odysseus, Athena tells him to leave behind his childhood. She inspires him with a new confidence, a new hope that makes him willing to risk the journey to see these heroes who are like legends from a mythical past. Once this action is underway, the shorter Odyssey, so to speak, of Telemachus, Athena turns to the major action of the poem, getting Odysseus himself home from the island of the goddess Calypso. Unlike the Iliad, which proceeds straightforwardly from the insult to Achilles through all of its consequences, the Odyssey moves far backward in time in the first half of the poem, before the forward motion resumes in the second half. In soliciting stories from Nestor and Menelaus, Telemachus hears tales about what happened when the Achaeans first left Troy, and then the various nostoi, or homecomings, of the heroes. He hears about how Agamemnon was murdered by his wife and her lover on his return home, and how Agamemnon's son avenged his death. He hears how Menelaus was blown so far off course on his way home that he found himself in Egypt, where he stayed for years, accumulating wealth, arriving at home fairly recently. Books 9 through 12 of the poem comprise the most famous part of the Odyssey, the story of his wanderings that Odysseus tells to the Phaeacians, ending with the event that put him on the island where we first see him in Book 5. So the action circles back. In a nutshell, the story is this. When the Trojan War ends, Odysseus starts home with 12 ships and goes through a series of harrowing adventures that kill off most of his men. The Cyclops, the Laestrygonians, Scylla and Charybdis, and so on. After the last remaining ship goes down in a storm, in the 3rd year after the end of the war, he is the lone survivor. He floats on a mast for 9 days before reaching the impossibly remote island of the goddess Calypso, where he stays for the next 7 years. It is the hero's situation here in this apparent paradise that I want to spend some time considering. Calypso's island is so beautiful that Milton uses it as the model for Eden in Paradise Lost. This is what the god Hermes finds when he first arrives there and looks around. There was a great fire blazing on the hearth, and the smell of cedar split in billets and sweet wood burning spread all over the island. She was singing inside the cave with a sweet voice as she went up and down the loom and wove with a golden shuttle. There was a growth of grove around the cavern, flourishing. Alder was there, and the black poplar and fragrant cypress. And there were birds with spreading wings who made their nest in it, little owls and hawks and birds of the sea with long beaks who are like ravens, but all their work is on the seawater. And right about the hollow cavern extended a flourishing growth of vine that ripened with great clusters. Next to it, there were 4 fountains, and each of them ran shining water, each next to each, but turned to run in sundry directions. And round about there were meadows growing soft with parsley and violets, and even a god who came into that place would have admired what he saw. The heart delighted within him. In many ways, a place like this looks like the ideal for every man suffering under the curse of Adam, beset by endless labor, always aware that death is coming, always short of the time that would give his life spaciousness and breadth. Homer already understands what advertisers 3,000 years later will depict as the end game of material success. Retirement at 40 with a supermodel wife on a private island somewhere in the middle of the South Pacific. Beaches, beautiful bodies, good things to eat and drink, nothing pressing to do. Not only does this beautiful goddess take Odysseus to bed with her every night, but she continually offers him ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods, so he can be immortal with her. Nothing forbids him from accepting. The only pressure he has, in other words, is to give up being mortal, a profound contrast with Achilles. He doesn't have to fear death. He has the offer of immortality right in front of him. He has time, as we could hardly dream of having time, day after day, time in abundance. And what does Odysseus do? When we first see this great hero in the 7th year of this apparently blissful existence, he's weeping on the beach, longing for his home in Ithaca. Athena convinces Zeus to send Hermes out across the endless stretches of ocean to tell Calypso to let Odysseus go. The messenger god gives Calypso the word, and she complains about how the gods treat her, but she goes to find the hero. Calypso found him sitting on the seashore, and his eyes were never wiped dry of tears, and the sweet lifetime was draining out of him as he wept for a way home, since the nymph was no longer pleasing to him. By nights he would lie beside her of necessity in the hollow caverns against his will, by one who was willing. But all the days he would sit upon the rocks at the seaside, breaking his heart in tears and lamentation and sorrow, as weeping tears he looked out over the barren water. Calypso reluctantly tells him the news that Hermes has brought her, and she tries to dissuade him from leaving her. If he knew what kinds of hardships he was going to have to undergo before he got home, she tells him, you would stay here with me and be the Lord of this household and be an immortal, for all your longing once more to look on that wife for whom you are pining all your days here. And yet I think I can claim that I am not her inferior, either in build or stature, since it is not likely that mortal women can challenge the goddesses for build and beauty. Odysseus knows very well who she is. She saved his life when he washed ashore nearly dead 7 years earlier, and he owes this debt of gratitude. He cannot leave the island without her blessing, and even to ask her for help getting away from her would be to insult her. Odysseus admits everything that she says. I myself know that all you say is true, and that circumspect Penelope can never match the impression you make for beauty and stature. But even so, what I want and all my days I pine for is to go back to my home and see my day of homecoming. Homer sees very clearly that this supposedly perfect life, this mirage that plays before the mortal imagination, will turn into a perfect hell of boredom because it allows him no exercise of his greatness of soul. Odysseus can roam the island at will and see the horizon in every direction, and there's nothing coming but more of the same. There's nothing to do. Instead of accepting an anonymous and obscure immortality, as George Dimmock argues in his great essay, The Name of Odysseus, Odysseus wants his own wife and son back, and he refuses Calypso's immortality, even though the sweet lifetime is draining out of him. Is Calypso's the immortality that Achilles would have wanted? Certainly not. What's demeaning about immortality with Calypso is that there would be nothing in it to hope for, nothing for the higher, irascible passions, although every concupiscible passion would be satisfied. Joseph Pieper describes human life as the status viatoris, the condition or state of being on the way, instead of the status comprehensoris, the state of one who has comprehended, encompassed, arrived. Calypso's name in Greek means to cover, to conceal, to hide. Suppose that Calypso is really the name for the best of Hobbes's commodious living, or to put it another way, the good understood in material or economic terms. She's the promise of a perfect world through the modern conquest of nature, the subtle entrapment of the job that's too generously rewarding in material terms to leave for something real and satisfying. This beneficent goddess who has provided such good things for us, who has repeatedly saved our lives with her medicine, and who wants to make us immortal just as we are, is also the loving tyrant who distracts us with pleasures and keeps us from our true home. The temptation to stay with Calypso embodies acedia in a way that we'll see again with Dido in the Aeneid and the Siren in the Purgatorio. Suppose that in her very being, in her very beauty, she attempts to conceal the nobility of Odysseus' true nature from him. Even in Calypso's most intimate presence, Odysseus misses the crucial thing. Calypso wants Odysseus to consider her and her island as though he had arrived at the goal of all human striving, and perhaps a lesser man would think he had. Something unmistakably great shows itself in Odysseus weeping over his situation, because it shows that he has not been misled by comforts. But the question is how Odysseus can get away from Calypso's island. What he needs is clearly not within his own power. If we think about Thomas's 4 characteristics of the object of hope, that it is in the future, good, difficult, impossible, can we realistically say that Odysseus has hope? He longs for home, certainly, the past good that is also his future good, and he's willing to undergo any difficulty, but it's impossible to get off the island. This is where Odysseus seems to me closest to theological hope, in the sense that his continuing to hope is not blind, but actually virtuous. His homecoming is not impossible if his divine patroness Athena remembers him. Think what he undergoes. Year after year goes by with no sign of her and not the faintest hint that anything will ever change. But he does not give up longing for his homecoming, because surely this goddess, so unlike Calypso in her intelligence and her support for heroic endeavor, will eventually remember him. And when at last she does convince Zeus to release him, and Odysseus hears the news from Calypso, Odysseus builds a seagoing raft in only 4 days and sails away from this false paradise as fast as he can, accepting all the hardships that will follow. Odysseus knows that he is very much the viator, the pilgrim or wayfarer, and that there is something better than Calypso's island to hope for, the reality that we understand through the symbolism of home. The more I think about Odysseus, the more I think that he's surprisingly compelling as a pagan prefiguring of the Christian who hopes for salvation. In his circumstances, salvation means homecoming, with everything that homecoming implies. Most centrally, his reunion with faithful Penelope. Christ uses the analogy of homecoming in the parable of the prodigal son, who finally remembers his father's house after squandering his inheritance. St. Augustine picks up the theme of homecoming as salvation in his book on Christian doctrine, as though he were thinking of Odysseus on the island of Calypso. Suppose then we were wanderers, Augustine says, in a strange country and could not live happily away from our fatherland, and that we felt wretched in our wandering and wishing to put an end to our misery, determined to return home. Later in the poem, Odysseus chides Athena for not being present to him for all those years, a remark that shows he was always looking for her. Of any character in ancient literature, Odysseus is the one most notable for the quality of intelligence that Homer calls metis, sometimes translated as cunning intelligence, and usually associated with artfulness or trickery. But one scholar adds that this word also meant a particular quality of intense awareness that always manages to stay focused on the whole, on the lookout for hints, however subtle, for guidance in whatever form it happens to take, for signs of the route to follow, however quickly they might appear or disappear. From all appearances, he has not had occasion to exercise his metis at all on Calypso's island, but in fact, it has been fully present in the intensity of his longing. I call this a sign of hope. And finally, one day, Calypso comes with the news that the gods have commanded her to release him. His future homecoming spills over into his last days on her island. He's already coming home as soon as he believes that he will succeed in getting there after enduring many hardships. Building the raft is not simply making a seaworthy vessel, but rebuilding the house he already inhabits in hope, because he firmly believes he will soon be there. Homer subtly underscores this existence of the future in the present. Here is Odysseus building the raft after Calypso shows him a stand of trees, all gone dry long ago and dead. An interesting description, by the way, so they would float lightly. Odysseus acts as though he had been thinking this out for years. He threw down 20 in all and trimmed them well with his bronze axe and planed them expertly and trued them straight to a chalk line. Calypso, the shining goddess at that time, came back, bringing him an auger, and he bored through them all and pinned them together with dowels, and then with cords he lashed his raft together. Far away from this description, almost at the end of the poem, after he's endured hardships at sea and killed the suitors who besiege his house. He and Penelope are reunited at last, but she still tests him by telling one of the maids to move Odysseus' bed outside the bedroom for him. He speaks to her angrily, asking who moved his bed, and he goes on to describe the way he built the room around an olive tree. Then I cut away the foliage of the long-leaved olive and trimmed the trunk from the roots up, planing it with a brazen adze, well and expertly, and trued it straight to a chalk line, making a bedpost of it and bored all holes with an auger. My point is that building the raft to escape from Calypso's island is already in hope returning to his marriage bed, which is not yet present, but which gives him all the more reason to build the raft well so his homecoming will not be delayed. Notice, by the way, that the bed that he makes in his house is made from a live tree, not from the dead one. Paradoxically, I'd argue, Odysseus works with such speed and efficiency because hope gives him back the reality of time. If Odysseus succumbed to the superior, superficial beauty of Calypso, if he did not know of something better and hoped to reach it, if he ever despaired of achieving the real thing, then what we know as the West would never have come into existence. The West begins not with the dream of commodious living, but with an inextinguishable hope to escape from Calypso's island and find the true home the soul yearns for. In his Regensburg address, Pope Benedict XVI speaks of the profound harmony between what is Greek in the best sense of the word and the biblical understanding of faith in God. And he goes on to point out that the New Testament was written in Greek and bears the imprint of the Greek spirit, which had already come to maturity as the Old Testament developed. He's speaking primarily of Greek philosophy, but already in this epic, we find the same harmony with biblical understanding. In Christian terms, Odysseus' metis is the openness to the slightest breeze of grace. His very longing draws divine action, and divine action frees him to the full dimensions of his hope. As a result, what was impossible is now possible. An epic hope becomes a new comic paradigm for the status Viatoris.